Well, guys, it's fun to be back with you. I think I was here in December, we decided, right? Was it December? Going through Ruth. One of the things we've done at our church is we usually pick an Old Testament book to do in the summertime. And so this past summer was Ruth, which worked well, and then a couple summers before was Daniel. And Daniel, I kind of took the lead on our Daniel series that summer, in part because it was the election year. We were all gearing up for the big contentious election in November. And so I thought that, hey, why don't we spend the summer looking at the book which deals the most with faithfulness dealing with pagan government. That might be a good way to prepare ourselves. And even in that way, the makeup of our community, we have a lot of government workers. We have a lot of, whether it's teachers, police, fire, first responders in that way. And so in a lot of ways, it just was pretty applicable just in terms of what does it look like to work within a government system in a way where you're still seeking to be faithful to God. That's what Daniel and his friends were. They became government officials. Tonight what I'd love to do is not even think about it so much specifically through the lens of government, but just the idea of working within the systems of this world. Working within whatever structure that it is where we find our professional life playing out. What does it look like to pursue faithfulness to God there? How late did we go, by the way? I forgot to ask you. 11. Perfect. That's great.
Anywhere 8:30, 8:45, somewhere in that range.
Sounds good. That's. I should be able to get somewhere close to that. Daniel's a ton of fun because in a lot of ways as well, it's got those stories, the lion's dens, the fiery furnaces, and things like that. But in some ways, as I spend a lot of time in this book, I think that there's this really dramatic turning point that happens in Daniel chapter 1 that sets the trajectory for everything else. And it's not the big flashbang, okay, we're going to get thrown into a fire and live story. It's something that's a lot more subtle. It's something that I think that perhaps if you or I were in that situation, we would not maybe, hopefully we would have, but it seems that most people did not even recognize the ethical dilemma that Daniel and his friends were in Daniel chapter 1. So that being said, if you will, let's go ahead and turn there. I think that in particular, I was so excited to get to come in at this part of it because I think that this period of the Old Testament, the exilic period, and especially the people that we have record of what their life was like while they were in exile, like Daniel and his friends, like Esther, in some ways I would say are the most applicable part of the Old Testament for us as followers of Jesus. Jared and I were talking before you guys got here just about the way that even in 1 Peter will pick up this same idea of being exiles, of being sojourners, and say, hey, the same experience that Daniel and Esther and those guys had of living as foreigners in a strange land, being far from home and finding a way to be faithful to God there, that's the identity that you need to strap on. So I think that in that way, we'll, toward the end of our time, definitely take a look at what does it look like to follow the example of Daniel and his friends in our time, in our day, in that same way of seeking to be faithful to God without finding our final sense of home here. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. I would love some interaction. Again, not spending a lot of time with you guys. I would love for you guys along the way to say, okay, here's how I'm thinking through this in my life. I would love to get that from you guys, and I'll even have you guys read with me as we go. Can I have somebody read Daniel 1, just the first two verses, just verses 1 and 2, please, nice and loud.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in a treasury of his God.
Cool. Thank you. All right. What happens in these verses?
King conquers.
King conquers who?
Judah.
What king is he?
King of Babylon.
King of Babylon. Okay. Awesome. So you may have got there in your reading, I don't know yet. The kind of final destruction of Jerusalem happens right around 586 BC. That's when basically Jerusalem's burned to the ground. Solomon's temple is destroyed. What we're reading here in Daniel chapter 1 takes place about 9 or 10 years earlier. Babylon is the major power in the region. Jerusalem has been kind of the kings of the line of David have been like puppet kings under him. And finally Jehoiakim says, forget it, I don't want to do that. He rebels, so Nebuchadnezzar comes down, basically takes the king, takes whatever he wants from the city, heads back, leaves the rest of the people there. The next king, Zedekiah, is going to rebel again, and that's when Nebuchadnezzar is just going to go, that's it, I'm done, and burn it to the ground. So we're about 10 years before that. So the majority, or at least a good chunk of the people, are still living back in Jerusalem. But what Nebuchadnezzar does here is he takes a few of the choice things. He takes the treasury from the temple. He takes these golden goblets from the temple, which will come up a little while later. I think around chapter 5, I think those golden goblets come back up. And he takes some of the, well, I didn't have you read this part, did I? In verse 3. Look at verse 3. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge and understanding and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So he takes the best and brightest young men in Judah, the king's sons, those of the royal family, those of the nobility, those who are the best looking, the smartest, says, I'm going to take them, recondition them, reintroduce them to Babylonian thought and culture and language, and then they will serve me. That's what's going on here. We get the majority of the people back home. This is who Daniel and his friends are. They are nobility, the best and the brightest, and they are taken as captives with no choice of their own, and said, you will now spend your life serving the king who conquered you and took you from your home and your family. That's kind of intense. Not only that, some people, who is this Ashpenaz guy? What's his title?
Chief eunuch.
Chief of staff.
The chief eunuch, which means he was mostly in charge of the other eunuchs. So some people have thought that perhaps in taking the best and brightest and conscripting them into his service, Daniel and his friends may have been eunuchs themselves. We don't know for sure. It's one of those things that, knowing kind of Jewish culture, especially how heroic Daniel and his friends stand out. If that was their situation, hey, the closest we'll get to out and out mentioning it is just saying they were under the charge of this guy who's the chief of the eunuchs, so you can connect the dots. But either way, the rest of their lives, whatever they were thinking and planning out, has now been completely changed. Why is all this happening? Why is Nebuchadnezzar sacking the city? Why is he taking the best and the brightest? This is God's chosen people in the promised land. Why is this happening to them?
Their sin and rebellion.
Okay.
It's prophesied by Ezekiel.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of the prophets talked about this very fact that, remember, the covenant relationship that you're in with Yahweh is one in which if you are not faithful to the covenant, he will not protect you. As a matter of fact, he says that he will fight against you. He will not keep you secure in your land. As a matter of fact, he will take you out of that land. So all of this is happening because the people as a whole are rebellious to the covenant. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, in particular, there's a place name here that maybe, again, if you've been going through the reading, you'll have to think way back to when you guys first started. But in verse 2, it says that he took some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, or Shinar, or however you want to pronounce it. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Mm-hmm. The land of Shinar. Turn back with me to Genesis chapter 11. Can I have somebody read Genesis 11 verses 1 through 4 for me?
Verses 1 through what?
4.
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth."
Okay, now does the land of Shinar sound more familiar to you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, think about this now. You're a Jew reading this for the first time, and you go, okay, wait, where did they take the vessels from God's temple? Where did they take the best and the brightest of God's people? Back to Shinar, back to Babel. Okay, so in Babel, the people, they get together, they take all of their God-given ingenuity and creativity and all the ability that they had as his image bearers, and they use it to do what?
Exalt themselves.
Okay. Make this great tower, make this great city, to make a name for themselves. How does God respond? He confuses their languages, and he what? He scatters them over the surface of the whole earth. Then, if you're still there, look at chapter 12. What happens in the first 3 verses of chapter 12 of Genesis?
Makes the covenant
With Abraham. Okay, so he makes the covenant. This is the first time God calls Abraham. And what does he promise to do with Abraham? Look at verse 2. "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Skip down a little bit farther. Verse 7. "The Lord God had showed Abraham the whole land of Canaan, and he says, 'To your offspring I will give this land.'" Up until Genesis 11, the entire scope of the story, or the scope of the biblical story, encompassed the entire human race. Whether it was just Adam and Eve, or whether it was just Noah and his family, something changes here between Genesis 11 and Genesis 12. Genesis 11, the plains of Shinar, the Tower of Babel, humanity united to make a name for themselves instead of living to put God on display. He confuses their languages, scatters them, and picks one man and says, "You come with me. I'm going to do something through you, make you into a great nation, bless your socks off, because ultimately through you, in the land that I'm going to give your descendants, I'm going to bring blessing to everyone." That's what the whole story's been about, right? God's plan to redeem humanity and the world through these promises made to Abraham and his family. A great nation living in a promised land with God's presence in their midst to make him known to the nations, as long as they're obedient to the covenant. But what did we just talk about is happening in Daniel 1? Why is Nebuchadnezzar sacking the city and taking the best and the brightest? They're not being faithful. And where are they going back to now? Shinar. Back to Babel. Back to the place of confusion and idolatry and rebellion. Do you sense the tension that's created just right here at the beginning of the book? If God's plan is to bring blessing to all nations through the people of Israel, how can he do that if now they're under his curse? If God's plan is to make his good rule known to the nations through Israel, how can he do that when they are just as rebellious as everyone else? Not only that, based upon the mentality of the time, wars were not just things that were fought between men and armies and governments and things like that. It was also seen as a contest of the gods. So therefore, whoever was victorious, well, obviously our gods are greater than your gods because we beat you up, right? So if Nebuchadnezzar had now brought the people of Yahweh under his thumb, it would be obvious to him and everyone else the gods of Babylon are greater than the God of Israel. How is God's redemptive plan going to go forward if this is the state that his people are in? If this is the state that his plan is in? And I would say, if you wanted to boil down what the book of Daniel is all about, it's this. No matter how things look, no matter how bad things might get, God is still in control, and he's moving things toward his ultimate end. Does that make sense? You'll see that throughout the book, especially as you get into the crazy visions at the end. There are going to be times where Daniel's going to go, wait, your people are going to suffer what? Wait, what's going to happen? I know, but no matter how bad it looks, no matter how bad it gets, God is still in control, and he's moving things relentlessly toward his purpose to bring blessing, to bring salvation, to end the reign of death and sin and Satan. He will get it there. But there's these points where it looks so bleak, like it does here in Daniel chapter 1. How is God going to pull it off? That's the tension in this part of the story. Now, let me do this again. Let me point something out to you in verse 2 as well. Just to show you, again, no matter how things look from the outside, what's God up to? Look at verse 2. Why is Nebuchadnezzar able to do this to the people of Judah?
The Lord gave him into his hand.
Okay, Nebuchadnezzar looks high and mighty. His gods look like the stronger gods, but yet the writer of this book says unequivocally, hey, Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's riding high on this. But the only reason he had this victory is because God was disciplining his people and gave them into his hand. And what's amazing is that in this book, what we see is simultaneously as God is disciplining his people for their unfaithfulness, there are these shining lights like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and Esther, who in the midst of really hard circumstances demonstrate greater faithfulness than the people had back in the land when everything was good, with greater impact on God's name being made known to the nations than, again, when they were back in the land and everything was good. By the time you get to chapter 6 of Daniel, 2 different emperors of 2 different empires have come to acknowledge Yahweh as the one true God who's truly in charge of the universe. That's what's amazing. Once God's people are taken out of their land, in some ways, they fulfill their missionary purpose better when they're not in the position of power, when they're in the marginalized position, when they're in the position of weakness. And gosh, doesn't that sound like the way that God works throughout his word? He accomplishes his most glorious victories when his people are in a position of weakness and vulnerability. Let's see how this happens. All right, so we already talked about, we got the best, the brightest. Daniel and his friends, they were studs. They were hot commodities unless they were eunuch. Then, at least in that way, they wouldn't have been as desirable. But other than that, let's look at what happens. Because there's something that happens. There's the tension on the one hand between how is God going to fulfill his plan when his people are so rebellious. But then there's the other tension on the other hand of if it would be obvious to everyone else that this is happening because the gods of Babylon are stronger than the gods of Israel, or the God of Israel. How are the people that are taken captive, are they going to just go, hey, you know what? I guess our king was conquered. I guess our God was conquered. Let's just go with the flow. When in Rome or when in Babylon, just do what the people do. How are they going to try to maintain their distinct identity? I think that's really what Daniel 1 is all about. Not just how am I going to keep my culture and not just be assimilated into this society, but more than that, how am I going to hold on to my identity as one of God's chosen people, with him as my God, rather than just absorbing the worldview of the Babylonians going on around? Look what happens here. Okay, so, verse 6. Actually, we'll start in verse 5. Can somebody read basically verses 5 through 8, please?
The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself.
Okay. On the one hand, for these young men, this would have been a lot of upheaval to the life that they had known. On the other hand, it could have been a lot worse. It could be in some stone quarry somewhere, just basically hacking rocks for the rest of their life. What does their captivity look like? A paid state-sponsored education with room and board, and not just ramen noodles, but like food from the king's table. 3-year education and a guaranteed, if you made it through, a guaranteed position of prominence and status within the government. Captivity's not looking so bad, is it? Wow. Okay, this is maybe Babylon's the land of opportunity. This is the Babylonian dream, right? We can come in, we can make it, we can make a name for ourselves here. But not just make a name for ourselves, because that was the one thing that Nebuchadnezzar didn't let them have. You can't keep your name. I'm going to change your name. What's significant about that? Does anybody know what Daniel means?
God judges.
Okay, yeah. God judges, or God is my judge. I don't know what the rest of them mean, but like when you see Hebrew names that end with EL, that's God. When you see ones that end with, where is it? Oh, Hananiah, like that IAH or the YAH, that's the beginning of Yahweh. That God's the name of the God of Israel is built into each one of their names. And so what Nebuchadnezzar does is there were, I don't know all of their names, but there was a Babylonian god called Aku. There was a Babylonian god called Nego. And so what he does is, okay, you have names that have your God's name built into them. I'm going to give you new Babylonian names, like Shadrachu. Ah, see, it connected to our God. Abednego. I'm going to give you this new identity under the Babylonian gods. And not only that, I mean, what's so cool is, okay, like, there's so much of this that they don't have control over, right? They didn't have a choice of being taken into captivity. They don't have a choice of whether they're going to go through this whole educational process. They don't have a choice of their name. The one thing that Daniel sees and says, hold on a second here, I may be able to do something about this, is in regard to the king's food. Why does that matter? Why is this the place where Daniel seeks to exert some sort of choice, some sort of influence on this situation?
Maybe because it's a direct offense to God where he's told them to eat a certain way, and it's like the first time that it's just a very clear, direct offense.
Okay. Yeah. What does he say will happen to him? Or does it say he resolved that he would not do what? Defile himself. He knew that in some way, that again, this obviously the Babylonians didn't keep kosher, but by doing this, he would be violating part of his commitment to God as a follower of Yahweh. But do you see what he does? He doesn't say, oh, I'm not eating that. You can't make me eat that. I'm going to start a social media campaign, hashtag don't make me eat this, right? What does he do? What does it say he does in verse? He resolves, I don't want to defile myself with the king's food. I want to hold on to my identity as one of Yahweh's people. I don't want to just go along with this. What does he do?
Negotiates.
He asks. Why is that key? Why is that important that he asks rather than demands?
Keeping peace. He's keeping peace.
Okay. He's keeping peace. Okay, yeah, that's definitely a more respectful way to go about doing that. But why would respect matter in this situation? What is he acknowledging and asking for permission rather than demanding rights?
He's acknowledging what God has done.
Okay.
Giving the land to Nebuchadnezzar to take at that time. And kind of his situation as where God has him.
Exactly. He recognizes, okay, God's brought me here. This is his doing. Not only that, you actually have authority over me.
Mm-hmm.
You actually are in a position of authority over me. It's not my place to just say, no, I'm not doing this. At the same time, though, can I have another way? Can I not defile myself in this way? Here's the thing I want you to understand. There's so much about their situation they couldn't control, but in this moment what Daniel recognizes is this isn't just about dietary preferences. This is about identity. This is about, okay, I'm in Babylon now. I'm being trained in the language and the culture of the Babylonians. I'm going to work in the king's court. But is that who I am? Do I find my identity in what I do, in my job? Or is God the one who defines my identity? And he's seeking to, in this way, through the dietary laws, to say, I still want to live out my identity as a follower of God. Even though I'm in a foreign land, even though I'm a captive, that doesn't change the fact that I'm still one who's in covenant relationship with Yahweh, and I want to be faithful to that to the degree that I actually have control over my circumstances. You see that? I recognize your authority over me. I'm not going to demand rights. I don't have rights. I'm a captive here. But at the same time, is there another way? Can I do something else? You see that? Look what happens in verse 9. So he asks permission, acknowledges this guy's authority over him. And what does God do? No matter what it looks like from the outside, God's in control. So how does God exert his control in this situation? God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. He says, Daniel, I feel for you, man. You got a tough shake in this whole thing. Please understand from my perspective as well. If I just let you eat what you want and don't give you the food that the king has commanded me to give you, and then you become this frail, sickly thing, that's my head. Right? You're going to endanger my head before the king. He says, man, I'm inclined to want to help you out, but please understand the high stakes that I face in this situation as well. Right? So here's what Daniel does, verse 10. Verse 11. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he goes, let's do a little test case of this thing. Okay, not even just the chief of the eunuchs. I'm going to the one guy who's in charge of me and my three buddies. Can we do a little trial program of this? Lessen the consequence and lessen the risk for everyone involved, right? I'm not trying to hang you out there to dry. But try it with us. For 10 days, give us nothing but vegetables and water to drink. And see how it is at the end. Like, see what our opinion is, or what our condition is like at the end. It says, verse 13, he says, then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Again, you see there's so much respect. Think about Daniel, the maturity that he's exercising here. These are his captors. He's not seeking to be a violent revolutionary. He goes, this is God's doing. He's put me under you. I'm acknowledging your authority. I'm going to even try to like not negotiate in a manipulative way, but I appreciate the way that you want to help me out. Can we do this in a way? I'm not trying to hang you out to dry in the same way. Could we try this thing out? Right? In doing this, like in some ways, he's putting God to the test, not in a bad way, not in the way that we're not supposed to put God to the test, but in that way of telling these pagans, try. See what happens if you give us the opportunity to be faithful to our God. See what will happen. But let's do it in a way where if this goes bad, I'm not trying to get you in trouble. So here's what happens, verse 14. He listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh. I guess a little like dad bod was in style at that point. They were fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables. Already here in this small, like this one I don't know, maybe you haven't spent a lot of time in Daniel recently. Maybe this one slipped your mind, or you've never heard this one. You've heard the lion's den, you've heard the fiery furnace, but I think in some ways this is the first test of faithfulness that Daniel and his friends face. And it's not a life or death situation yet. It's at the much more subtle, maybe easy to brush aside level of who gets to define my life. Is it just the system that I set myself in? Is it just the industry that I'm trying to break in? Or do I seek to, even whatever environment my life is played out in, am I still going to acknowledge God's claim to my life? Am I still going to acknowledge that He defines who I am? And is that going to be the guiding principle that shapes the way that I interact in these various settings in life? Now here's the crazy part, because Daniel and his 4 friends aren't the only guys in this training process. Right? There's this whole slew of young men. And he says there's all these other young men going through this. Most likely other young men from the nobility from Judah. Did this just go over all the other guys' heads? Did they just go, well, if this is the way the Babylonians do it, then that's the way that we need to do it? Were Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, were they the only ones to stop and go, hold on, there's something more that's food at stake here. This is about our identity as God's people. This doesn't mean that we know because only God can judge me, I can do what I want. God's put us here. He's put these people in authority over us. How can we appeal to them and reason with them and make requests of them in a way that acknowledges their authority and gives God an opportunity, and it sounds bad to say, like, presents an opportunity for God to demonstrate His faithfulness to these men who've never heard of Him before. Right? This really is that kind of dividing line, if you will. Are we going to just go with the flow and adopt this new identity? Or are we going to seek to stay true to our identity in Yahweh? Yes, we're these servants. Yes, we're these slaves. Yes, we're possibly these eunuchs who have to spend the rest of our life in the king's court. That's what we do. That's not who we are. Who we are, our identity in God, is going to then define and shape what we do, which means you get to chapter 3 when Nebuchadnezzar says, here's this great statue, everyone's got to bow down to it. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go, no, you know what, this is a lesson we first learned with the food on the table. That's not who we are. Yeah, we're here, we're working in your government. Not only that, look what happens at the end of the chapter. Verse 17. Can somebody read 17 through the end of the chapter, please?
And for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days, which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of all of them, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than the magicians and conjurers who were in all of his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king.
The end of their 3-year training process, they're the cream of the crop. They're the top of the class. When they have their interview in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, he says, these guys are 10 times better than all the other guys you created. Why were they so good? Was this just their natural ability?
Because God gave them the knowledge.
Yes, there's 3 times here in chapter 1. We talked about sometimes, especially in a book like this, God's actions are somewhat under the surface. When we get to the visions, it's very much more, no, God steps in and says, I'm speaking for myself. But here, there's 3 times in chapter 1 where the phrase God gave is used. In verse 2, God gave Jehoiakim and Jerusalem into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Down in verse 9, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the eyes of the chief of the eunuchs. And verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all the literature and wisdom. Now, stop. Let's talk about that for a second. All literature and wisdom, what is that talking about? Bible study, right? It's like they went to Bible college, right? Because God cares that we know this book, right? Well, yes, absolutely. Don't get me wrong. He cares that we know this book, which is why we're spending this time. But what knowledge and literature and wisdom did he give them?
Babylonian training.
Okay, think about that for a second. God gave them the ability to understand and perceive the literature and wisdom of the Babylonians. It mattered to him to equip them well to function with not just competence, but excellence in their role in the king's court. You're going to see toward the end of this, where next thing you know, Daniel's basically second in line to the king. There's something the reformers would often talk about, what they would call the ministry of competence. That one of the ways in which God's people are meant to stand out as lights for Jesus is by being really good at what we do. We ought to be those who our employers never question our work ethic. They never question our passion and commitment to do it well. Why? Because as Paul says in Colossians 3, we are working for the Lord, not for men. God gave Daniel and his 3 friends knowledge and wisdom to be in skill, to be excellent in the job that they were going to have. And not only that, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom prospers because of their service. They become trusted officials, not by becoming Babylonian, but by remaining faithful to God. Now think about this for a second. Here's what I want us to think about together. We have a lot of similarities between Daniel and his 4 friends. Living in a setting that is not, if you're a follower of Jesus, I would say less and less do you feel like a native. Or that our way of viewing the world is the mainstream way of viewing the world. And I was actually saying that's a very helpful clarifying thing for us. In that situation, though, we have to recognize, okay, there is a sense in which we ought to embrace the fact that we will be outsiders. We will be different. We will not always fit with the mainstream. And that's actually not a bad thing. I would say perhaps the biggest area of difference is that Daniel and his 3 friends didn't have a choice in their line of work. They were conscripted as slaves to work in Nebuchadnezzar's court. For us, most of the time, there is a lot more element of choice in the types of work that we pursue. Do we think as hard as Daniel and his friends did about this idea of identity in the workplace? Everybody else went along and ate the king's food. Daniel and his 3 friends went, hold on a second here. This is something where we need to be different because we have a different identity. This is where I'd love to hear from you guys. As you're thinking through this and processing this, in the line of work that you have chosen to pursue, where have been those places? Either maybe beforehand, like in the moment, like these guys did before they ate the king's food, they went, okay, this is an identity issue. Or maybe afterward, a couple years in, you went, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for a while, and now I realize this goes against who I am as a follower of Jesus. How have you navigated that? Or where have you sensed that tension?
Conversational interaction.
Okay. What do you mean?
Just things that I would tolerate, not being in the Word and a follower of Christ, things that I would let go, some impurities of conversation, guy talk,
Okay.
kind of situation.
That you would contribute to, or just like
I would
hearing
contribute
it?
to, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Because that's just the way it is, right? That's like, we have that chameleon sense in us as humans where we want to adapt to our environment.
As far as even that's like belonging, you just want to feel like,
Yeah.
But then once you come into that situation where you become a follower of Christ, it makes it easier for you to disconnect because it doesn't line up to either what you're learning, what you're teaching, and the people that you're around. So now you don't feel as pulled to engage in those kind of situations.
Well, where can you fall off on the other side? I'm going, well, because I'm a Christian, I'm just going to be off over here to the side and not interact with others. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think the challenge is to figuring out how you can be effective while also maintaining the truth of how your connection with God. But at times I think you might feel that being more of a chameleon allows you to be more effective. And in times that might be true, depending on how far you go, but there's a certain line, and figuring out that line I think is the important, for me I found that to be the important challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. The line. The line.
Where that is,
the
yeah.
line.
And I don't know, and maybe it's different for different people in different circumstances, but yeah.
I think about like how we've faced that because we love being with so many people that don't know Christ and don't adhere to our faith at all. And so I think like when Jesus was called a drunkard and he was accused of things because he was with people that may appear one way but not. I mean, it can go.
Mm.
What's something you would say, okay, this is obviously over the line?
Right.
Specific to your line of work, where would you go? This wouldn't violate my identity in Christ.
I think for me, it's like, I would just choose to not to participate in certain things because my firm, you know, I think alcohol is just really common because any type of connectivity or networking, there's always alcohol involved. And I do think alcohol, you know, could be a way to connect with people, but when it's too extreme and you can just choose not to be part of it and still be okay that there may be other people that want to participate, and you can still go and maybe have just water or something and still be able to connect with people without having to feel like you also need to drink.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I think that we, well, from me and Jovan, I think like Jovan kind of decided to like step away from like a fuller schedule to be able to participate more in the church body. And I think like that was, I just remember that being like a harder, like a difficult decision because in his work, he is kind of expected to be on call all the time. And even to just be able to tell his employer that it was because of like commitment to church or to like family, that was, I think, like telling them what his priorities were.
Yeah, there is a communication of priorities.
Yeah.
And I think that like a workplace can definitely be one of those places that there are employers who seek to set your priorities for you.
Yeah.
And there's a place to say, thanks, I appreciate working here, I want to be a good worker, but at the same time, understand you're not the only authority or the ultimate authority in my life. How do you do that without being a jackass? You know what I mean? We're going to have to be countercultural in that way, because how do you affect change? You kick up dust, you start a social media campaign, you shame people into oblivion, and then you get your way, right? That's how it's done. What did Daniel and his guys do? God gave them favor, and they asked it. And they found a way through, and they were able to demonstrate God's faithfulness, and they were able to build trust. And it didn't mean it was smooth sailing, right? Because we're going to find out 2 chapters later, they're going to have to go through the fire, literally, because they went, okay, this is one. And I think that's the thing. Sometimes we think about it like, if my employer ever asked me to like do something absolutely illegal, I would be no, right? But this is why I think it's so powerful that the book of Daniel starts this way, because this is one that I think for most people you go, well, that's how you get a head start. That's how you break in. Yeah, I know that's not ultimately what you want to do, but you got to get your foot in the door. And I think for Daniel and his friends, they went, hold on a second here. Maybe there's a different way to get our foot in the door. Not only that, I would say the difference for us is sometimes the places where we make compromises are for doors we want to go through. Maybe not even necessarily doors that God is calling us to go through, right? And I would say that's kind of where this this identity piece really comes into play, because whatever identity you place on the top as this is ultimately who I am, you'll sacrifice to protect that. You'll sacrifice to attain that. And so if, again, just picking one around, if your identity is I am an aspiring actor who follows Jesus, it will be really easy to go, well, I'm just going to, Jesus, you're in this little pocket over here, but this is the main goal I'm trying to get at. I was meeting with a group of guys in our church who were law enforcement officers, and I just was asking them that question, the idea of what does it look like to recognize that as an authority, with authorities over you, God is still the ultimate authority that you are ultimately answerable to, not just your commanding officer. And it was interesting to see how it's just like, I don't know what to do with that. Like, it's tough in our line of work. Again, like we're trained. This is the way they train us. We got to respond in the moment. And it was almost that sense of saying, if you disrupt this really habitual thought process that I've developed, it's going to be a safety liability for me. If next thing you know, in a situation with a guy that I'm trying to track down, I've got to think, what does it look like to put the identity of Christ above my identity as a law enforcement officer? I can't think through all of that in the moment as I'm chasing down a perp, right? It's like, okay, again, that's the thing. Like, this was a part of their training process. They were fighting this battle as they embarked on this career, if you will. And that's what began it, right? And for most of us, what we do is we get into the career, we get things settled, we get the house, we get the family, we get the 2 kids and the dog, and then we go, hold on, shouldn't Jesus be a part of this? And I would say, especially knowing that many of you are in either a training process or a breaking in process, this is the time to ask those questions. Which identity do I put on top? Which identity will I sacrifice and say no to? Say no for, right? I told you before we were going to go toward the end to 1 Peter, and so let me just go there really quickly, and then I want to give you just practically. Here's some thoughts on how to think through some of these situations. 1 Peter chapter 3. Again, like I said, this is one where Peter says, hey, look back at those guys living in exile, because that's a model for us and how we seek to live as strangers and exiles, representing Jesus in the various cultures in which we find ourselves. And he says this in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 13. Where'd it go? Let me get to my page. I think I used a different translation than I have. He says, verse 13, it says, for who is going to harm you if you are devoted to do what is good? Most of the time, if you're seeking to do what's right, you'll steer out of a lot of trouble. But not all the time, right? But in fact, if you happen to suffer for doing what is right, which happens with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at the fiery furnace, which happens with Daniel in the lion's den. If you happen to suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. But do not be terrified of them or be shaken, but set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts. I don't know if you have a different translation, it'll say something like, in your hearts regard Christ the Lord as holy. I think that there's a lot of church language in that kind of obscures it. It's like, oh, in my heart, Jesus, you're holy, 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 like the hymn says, that's who you are. I like the way that the New English translation where they put it, where they say, set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts. What does that word Lord mean? Master, king, absolute authority. In a society that said Caesar is Lord, the Christians said, no, Jesus is Lord. He is that ultimate authority. So what does Peter say to do to navigate through serving God within godless systems? It starts with setting apart Christ as Lord in your hearts. Now, even sometimes that phrase, in your hearts, can stop us, because if you're like me and you grew up in the church, I asked Jesus into my heart a ton of times. Jesus, you are Lord in my heart. Yeah, well, it's not just that he's talking about he's only Lord in here, but he's saying in here, at the seat of your emotions and your will and your desires, Jesus, you have absolute veto power. Not just veto power, you have the authority to put desires in my heart and take desires out of my heart. You are Lord. Now, seek to operate and do good and recognize you're blessed even if you suffer in the process. Set Christ apart as the ultimate king, not just in your heart, not just in your personal life, your family life, in your professional life as well. Just like Daniel and his friends did. Okay, Lord, you're the king. Even though Nebuchadnezzar's the king, you're the ultimate king. And you'll show him that down in chapter 4. But help us to know how to navigate through this in a way where we can still serve that king while we serve you as king. Help us to do it in a way that's respectful, in a way that asks and recognizes those in authority over us, but recognizes you're the ultimate authority, right? Set Christ as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope that you possess. That might sound more familiar. It's the one that made me really intimidated. I don't know how to talk about the dinosaurs and what happened to them. Because give an answer for the hope that's in you has typically been interpreted as, that's right, give a logical, reasoned, scientifically verifiable response for why you believe this book. But in the context, what does he say? Seek to do good in the work that God's given you to do. Make Christ the ultimate king that you're serving in doing that. And sometimes that will create conflict in the workplace. But as you rest in that authority of Jesus as Lord, even if you suffer in the process, you'll be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who goes, our God is able to deliver us from those flames, but even if he doesn't, we will not bow down to that idol. And then they're in the flames, and there's another guy in there, and they come out, and Nebuchadnezzar goes, oh my gosh, this God is something real, right? Set Christ apart as Lord. Let that begin to help you to navigate. Don't ask, where's the line? Jesus, would you show me where's the line? Would you pull back the ways that I've deceived myself? I said, well, I'll put the line here. Maybe this part, I'm going to move it a little bit farther here. This is also why this setting apart Christ as Lord and discerning what's best isn't something you do alone. Because I'll tell you right now, I am the easiest person to deceive myself, right? I can trick myself in believing my own best intentions when I had no good intentions at all in what I was doing. I was having lunch with a friend of mine from our church, where he works in the entertainment industry. I think it's something having to do with editing or something like that. And we were just talking, he goes, you know what? It didn't used to be like this, but I feel like more and more of the stuff I have to work on, it is really hard for me as a believer to work on this stuff and know that I'm a part of putting it out there. But it's just, I've been doing this job for years, and it's grown more and more. And it was funny, I was studying this passage getting ready to teach you guys, and so I just said, well, Daniel asked for something else. Do you think you could do that? Do you think that, again, in our day and age, there's some sort of provision, if you have a religious objection to the content, that, again, you're known, you've developed trust, they know you're not trying to get out of the work, and he's like, yeah, we got plenty of work to do. I don't know, I should try that. And again, it was one of those things where in the process, it never had occurred to him to go, I should ask if I don't have to work on these things, if I can work on something else. It's like, dude, that's awesome. Not because I had all the answers, but it's like the way that God coordinates things that we're learning and studying in different ways, right? I've got some other friends where I feel like these are questions they need to be asking. And I'm praying about going, okay, how do I not be the headstrong pastor telling people what to do, but say, hey, have you thought about this? Does that accord with your identity in Christ? Because we're not supposed to live off on our little cloisters. And again, you're talking to the guy who works in a church around Christians all the time. So I understand that this is really easy to stand on the outside. You all need to figure this out. I'm saying we probably don't need too many more people who work in environments like I do. We need a lot more followers of Jesus who are in environments like you do and are seeking to be Daniels and Shadrachs and Meshachs and Abednegos there. I want to help you think through it. Not because I have all the answers, but hey, maybe I can help us ask the right questions. Right? So here, let me give you a couple of things just to think through by way of application. And I'd love to even encourage you guys, toss these around. I know you have some discussion groups or something like that meet in between this. Let me throw these around. As you're seeking to navigate this whole thing, again, first, remember your primary identity. I'm not consuming anybody, I don't know you guys. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, if you have trusted in him as your Lord, as that one who conquered sin and death on your behalf, make that the top. That's the first thing on your CV, right? That is the thing. I'm not saying it literally has to be on there when you send it out, but I'm saying for you, the way you perceive it yourself, you're not first the musician. You're not first the waiter. Nobody wants to first be the waiter, right? Whatever it is, you are a follower of Jesus. That's That's where the definition of who you are starts. Jesus, you're my king. I've set you apart as the Lord in my heart. I'm seeking to overturn more of those areas that I haven't given to you yet. I'm with other people who are going to go, wow, yeah, you're really not following Jesus in that. Oh, that's right, Jesus, you're Lord. I want to follow you there. That's where it starts. That's where it started with Daniel and his friends. Why were they so faithful throughout the rest of the book? Because at the start of it, they said, we're going to figure out a way to make sure that Jesus is Lord of this whole thing. And it took them into some really hairy situations. So that's the first one. The second one I would say is this. Pray for wisdom to recognize the temptations to compromise that you face in your life and your work. Again, it's not typically at the shoot this person in the head, or it's not something that intense, right? It's not going to be bow down to this idol or I'll throw you into a furnace. But typically it never starts there. It starts with the much more subtle thing of this is what you do to get your foot in the door. This is how you get ahead. This is just the way that business is done.
Eat this food.
Right? Just the way it happens, right? This is, go with the flow, go with the program. Number 3, I would say this. This is what we talked about a second ago. Pray for competence, and then work to be competent. Pray that God would not just like help you to think spiritually in regard to your work. If there's something you're really having a hard time mastering, do you believe that God cares about the work that you do? If God would equip Daniel and his friends with learning and skill in Babylonian literature and wisdom, do you think that he can help you do whatever task or element of your studies that you're having a hard time with? Pray that God would give you competence and work to be competent. Number 4, pray for favor with those in authority over you. And I would say that that's really connected to the one before as well. If you're seeking to be competent and work for the Lord and not for men, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to gain favor and trust with those who are in authority over you. But pray for it. God, would you do that? If you got that really hard-headed boss that's like the devil wears Prada kind of person, where it's just like they want to drive you into the ground. God, would you, if you can change Pharaoh's heart, could you change their heart? Could you give me favor? If you could make it so that the Egyptians wanted to give the Israelites their gold and jewels as they headed out of Egypt, you can do this. Would you give me favor with those difficult people that are in authority over you? Number 5, when faced with a compromising situation, respectfully ask and suggest an alternative. Instead of that, I have a conviction against, I'm a follower of Jesus, that's just not something I'm comfortable with doing. Could I do this instead? Recognize their authority. Don't just put your foot down and claim your rights. Let's be different in that way. Let's respect those that we're seeking to reach. When faced with a compromising situation, respectfully ask and suggest an alternative. So they know you're not just trying to get out of work. You're ready and willing to submit to their authority, even as you're saying, would you respect that I have a conviction about this? Number 6, if granted that alternative, if given the chance to do something else, make them glad they did that for you. Like, make it worth their while. I'm not saying some sort of kickback, like quid pro quo kind of thing. But I'm saying through the excellence of you working for the Lord and not for men, if they accommodate you in that way and allow you to serve or operate in some different way because you're a follower of Jesus, seek to make them glad they did. Oh man, that actually, you know what? The boss above me said, hey, great job with what they did on that thing. I now gain some status and some recognition because of what you did. I'm glad. Hey, you know what? Let me know if there's anything else that comes up that you have a hard time with, because I know I can trust you with the work I give you. And number 7, this is what really comes up later in the book of Daniel. If you're refused, if you're told, no, you have to do this, and you know that it is something clearly that violates God's desire for you, your identity in Christ, you most likely won't face a fiery furnace, but you may get fired. Do you trust the Lord that He is still able to provide and protect and guide you in that process? Whatever identity you place at the top, you will sacrifice for that. If that is identity in Christ, you will give up things for that. If it's the identity of who you want to be as a professional, the Tower of Babel that you want to build to make a name for yourself, you will sacrifice your identity in Christ in order to pursue that. That's what stands out so much to me about Daniel 1. It was food, good food, royal food. They were going to eat like kings. They went, no, this is the line we can't cross because we want to be faithful to our God. Most of the guys didn't even recognize it. They saw it. And by the end of the book, like I said, 2 emperors, Nebuchadnezzar and Darius the Mede, go, the God of Israel is the one true God of heaven and earth. We acknowledge him. That would not have happened if they went with the flow and did what they needed to do to get ahead and get a foot in the door. Never underestimate the impact of costly obedience.